You um, mentioned the language, and how controversial language becomes when we talk about Palestine. You referenced concentration camp with regard to Gaza. I was watching you on a podcast, Comedy Sellers podcast, where you were talking or debating with Eli Lake of the Daily Beast. And when you use the term mowing the lawn or mowing the grass, uh, there was a woman, I don't know who she was. I don't
She
even know.
worked for the program, absolutely
Right.
pleasant woman.
Right. But she got really upset by that term. She said it's...
You know what? That just shows that she's a real human being. You should get upset. Because of the 2,300 blades of grass in Gaza, half of them are children. And yet that phrase is just thrown around like it's just so cute and so clever and so funny. And she actually was in a state of denial. Like, I don't believe that people could say that. And it's perfectly plausible that she didn't know.
Right.
Yeah. You have to follow the conflict, even though it's a commonplace, but still you have to follow the conflict. It is a shocking term. And
Definitely.
The point I made was, if you take the case of Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, and you look at the figures, roughly speaking, Israel says 1,400 people were killed by Hamas militants. 1,400 Palestinians were killed in Operation Cast Lead. If you look at the number of combatants versus civilians on October 7th versus Cast Lead, they're roughly the same. So I said, how would people react if Hamas said, we were just mowing the lawn? I mean, people would not be able to contain their outrage and indignation. This would be proof positive of what human animals they are. And yet Israelis just casually use that phrase. So it's to her credit that she was shocked by the term and was in part in denial about the use of the term. Like, I never heard of it. So I credit her for that.
And what I wanted to ask you was, could you talk about how Israel uses this term? When did they start using this term? And is this current operation part of this process? Because it feels the magnitude, as you said, is so large when it comes to what's happening now.
This current operation is qualitatively different. This is not mowing the lawn. This is an attempt at a cross between annihilation and ethnic cleansing. If they had their choice, just because of PR, not because they care a whit about the life of any Palestinian, but if they had the choice, they would want to expel them all into the Sinai. Why have to bear the stigma of having exterminated the population? They wouldn't care. I mean, they care as much about the population as Americans did during the so-called Indian Wars. You're just exterminating savages. So they wouldn't have cared, but because there is an international community to whom you're technically accountable, though Israel has never been held legally accountable, but technically they're accountable. There are so-called laws of war, there are international treaties, there are international covenants, and so forth. And also Israel likes to, it calls itself a civilized power in a jungle. They're living in the jungle, namely the other Arab world. They would prefer not to exterminate them. So their goal would be ethnic cleansing, to expel them all into the Egyptian Sinai via the Rafah border crossing. But in the absence of that, I would say it's still unclear what they're going to do. As I said already, Gaza is among the most densely populated places on earth. They've emptied out the northern half of Gaza, which means among the most densely populated places on earth is now double the density has doubled because the whole population from the northern sector has been forced into the southern sector. And it's quite clear that Israel is going to annex large parts of the northern sector and call it its new security zone, or they call it buffer zone, sometimes security zone. So what they're going to do with those people, I haven't a clue. Their current plans are clearly genocidal. It's not even controversial, actually. If you just add up the statements, President Herzog said there is no distinction between civilians and combatants. Defense Minister Gallant said there will be no water, food, electricity, or fuel admitted to Gaza. And Prime Minister Netanyahu said this was going to be their longest operation. Well, Protective Edge lasted 51 days. So if you add up those three statements, what do you get? For 51 plus days, there'll be no food, water, electricity, or fuel admitted to any of the population of Gaza. Well, that's a murder plan. That's not complicated. That's what we might call simple addition. Take those three statements, add them up. And now, Noam Dworman said, can't you forgive what people say in the heat of anger? They made these statements on October 8th. And that certainly would be a reasonable argument. The problem is we're 3 weeks later and they're implementing that plan. It's not, they're implementing the plan. They're not letting in fuel, water, food, or electricity. And they're not making, clearly from the bombing, they're not making any distinctions between civilians and combatants. Right now, about 3,500 children have been killed. That's more than the number of children killed in every war zone in the world in 2020, 2021, 2022. Take for all the children killed in every war zone in the year 2020, in every war zone in the year 2021, in every war zone the year 2022, in each of those years, more children in Gaza have been killed than for the whole of 2020, 21, 22. Yeah, that's a fact. So the fellow I was technically debating, though it really wasn't a debate, it was more like child abuse because he didn't know anything.
He said nothing. Yes, it's true. He said nothing.
He sneeringly said, well, does that include Ukraine? Well, actually, it's an interesting statistic. In 20 months in the Ukraine, 20 months in Ukraine, 500 kids have been killed. In 3 weeks in Gaza, 3,500 have been killed. It's a murder plan. I can't say what the end game is going to be because Egypt is being adamant about not opening the Rafah border because it doesn't want the Palestinians to come into its country and create new troubles for Sisi, President Sisi, who already has major problems, primary among them economic. So you can't keep them there because the density of the population is going to double, and it's already among the most densely populated. Or just kill them off by starvation. I don't know. I can't tell you what the answer is there. I don't believe Hamas has the military capacity to prevent a utter military annihilation. And Hezbollah, the party of God in Lebanon, has indicated that it's not going to do much. Not that it could do much, but it's clear it can't. So I think there's every reason to be very pessimistic about what's going to happen. And I'm not going to give false grounds for hope.
Speaking of Hamas, you have probably witnessed. I know you saw Gilad Erdan show off the Star of David and compare the plight of the Israelis to the persecution committed by the Nazis, and there's a lot of Hamas equals Nazis comparisons going on. I wanted to pull up an article. I don't know if you're familiar with this historian, um, Dr. Finkelstein, Mr. Andrew Roberts, but he wrote an article in the Telegraph, which is an abhorrent article, but on October 30th. And I wanted to read just the last few paragraphs of it shortly and have you react to it, because I'm noticing, especially among Israel's biggest sympathizers, this is the narrative that's being peddled. He says, just as Hamas is using roadblocks to prevent Palestinians from moving south and away from Israeli attack on northern Gaza, so it is also preventing Palestinians from moving on from the utterly doomed hope of retaking the land of Israel. While the vast majority of displaced peoples of the late 1940s have eschewed the path of violence, instead choosing peacefully to try to advance their national stories and make the best of their circumstances, getting their revenge by working hard, living well, and being happy, the Gazans voted for Hamas in 2006. The Palestinians have thus become willing dupes of a cynical policy of foreign countries to use them to pressurize and destabilize the world's sole Jewish state. Were each Arab state to take 100,000 Palestinians, fewer than the number of Ukrainians that Britons welcomed in, then Gazans would be safe. But that would mean a safer Israel, which is not what some Arab states want. Until the Palestinians are finally able to accommodate themselves to the fact that Israel is here to stay, they can never find contentment. And then the end of the article goes, Benjamin Netanyahu's best reply to those demanding a ceasefire before Israel can destroy Hamas ought to be that of his hero, Winston Churchill, who on 14th of July, 1941 said, "We ask no favors of our enemy. We seek from them no compunction. On the contrary, if tonight the people of London were asked to cast their vote whether a convention should be entered into to stop the bombing of all cities, the overwhelming majority would cry, no, we mete out to the Germans the more the measure that they have meted out to us." So, Dr. Finkelstein, this is something that I'm hearing a lot, this comparison, Hamas to Nazis, and this is sort of a soliloquy to that. Your take, your reaction to this narrative that's being bandied about.
In 2006, January 6th, I think, 2006, there were elections held in the occupied Palestinian territories, the West Bank and Gaza. Those elections were in large part in response to a demand made by George Bush. That was the era of what you might recall as democracy promotion. You remember that era in the Bush administration. So one of the exemplary cases of democracy promotion was calling for elections in the occupied Palestinian territories. Now, the Palestinian Authority, the current administration in the West Bank, was hopelessly corrupt. And so the Palestinians, in these parliamentary elections, handed over a victory to Hamas because Hamas had a reputation for being honest. I'm not saying that reputation continued afterwards, but at the time, they had a vast social service network, then the mosques, and then in general, they lived a austere life. For example, I remember when I visited, I don't know if he was the head of Hamas at that time. He may not have been, but one of the leaders of Hamas, Dr. MTC, in Gaza, I met him. And whatever you thought of him, there's no question that he lived a very austere, simple life. For those of us, which doesn't include you, who have memories of the tenements in the 1930s, it was like a tenement where he lived. In any event, they won the elections. They had a political party arm of the movement, and they ran on a reform platform. And Gazans, to my thinking perfectly rationally, they voted for Hamas because it was the better alternative to the Palestinian Authority. And there were basically only two options at the time, not unlike our own Democratic and Republican Party, two basic options. And Hamas at the time, it was began putting forth quite reasonable proposals for trying to resolve the question with Israel. Some of the proposals, I always forget the Arabic term. What's the Arabic term for a 30-year truce? There's a specific term for that, a truce. And then there were also proposals to settle the question on the basis of what's called the international consensus, the global consensus for solving it, namely two states and the June 1967 border and so forth. But all of those proposals were rebuffed by the Israel and by the United States. And instead, the US and Israel imposed that brutal blockade on Gaza. Now, there were periods where Gaza was actually doing okay. For example, the period roughly 2010 to 12, I can't go into now why they were doing okay, but the economy seemed to be doing okay. And what did Israel do? It was appalled by the fact that Hamas was normalizing its condition and also normalizing its relations with various countries, Qatar, Turkey. And so Israel, as always, it provoked another exchange of a armed exchange, and then it went in and it launched what was called Operation Pillar of Defense. Basically, Israel wouldn't accept anything other than what it had established in the West Bank, namely a subservient, or what's called a subcontractor, namely the Palestinian Authority. But they were always committed to not allowing for a real Palestinian state in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. And by that time, once this experience had played itself out, the Hamas became very hardened to any possibility of a settlement on the terms of the international consensus. And they said they weren't going to travel down the same path as the Palestinian Authority to just become new subcontractors for Israel, not in the West Bank, but this time in Gaza.
Yes. Thank you for that. No, I think that's really helpful context. And I just wanted
another point I would make. I have
Yes.
to watch the time.
Okay.
The other point I would make is this whole question of resettling of the Palestinians in Arab countries. And we have to be honest about these things. Yes, in theory, that is a possibility. But you're going to have to ask yourself the question, if the people want to stay, it's their home now. They were expelled in 1948. It's now 75 years later. It's where they established their home, their lives, their neighbors, their friends, marriages, and so forth. If the people want to stay, should we, in the interest of expediency, tell them they should leave? So let's take an example from our own American history. Beginning in like the 1820s, roughly, I don't have a precise timetable, when the question of what to do with the slaves came up. So there are people who advocated the emancipation of the slaves. This included Lincoln. Advocated the emancipation of the slaves, but on one condition: they had to leave. That Lincoln was convinced of the fact that blacks and whites couldn't live together. And so there were all of these colonization schemes. And then there were blacks who said there's no possibility, no future of black people in the United States, and therefore they should go to Africa. So there were colonization schemes by those who supported emancipation, but emancipation with colonization. And that was among whites. And there were emancipation schemes among blacks, which, well, they wouldn't be emancipated, they would just be, as it were, they would leave. And then there were people like Frederick Douglass and the abolitionists who said no, they should have the right to be here and be emancipated. So you have to ask yourself the question, was Douglass wrong? Were the abolitionists wrong? Were those who advocated colonization? Because it's true. Just think for a moment. If blacks had gone to Haiti, which is what people like Lincoln advocated, if American blacks were emancipated and then shipped off to Haiti, or if they went to Africa, just think about how that would have solved the problem. We wouldn't have had a civil war. 700,000 Americans wouldn't have been killed. Then we wouldn't have had all the history of 200 years of racial conflict, because this is 1820, 1920, 220. So we have we wouldn't have had George Floyd. We wouldn't have had race riots. We wouldn't have had explosions in ghettos. So, should we say those who said black people should stay, should we say they were wrong? Expediency, pragmatism would seem to weigh on the side of they should have left. But how many people would say that now? How many people would say the colonization schemes were the right thing? How many people would say emancipation and the right to vote and equal rights was the wrong thing? Because that's what you're telling the Palestinians. You're telling them they shouldn't stay and fight for their rights where they are. They should leave. And that will, as this author says, simplify the problem.
Yes, it's truly an expression of just eradicate the Palestinian population from Palestine. That's essentially what he's arguing.
Ethnically cleanse it and let them go live with their Arab brothers and sisters, just like we said, or those who advocate the colonization schemes, let them go live with their brothers and sisters in Africa or in the Caribbean.
Yes, yes, indeed. Dr. Finkelstein, I know I only have a few more minutes with you. I wanted to just get your quick reaction to the
Please,
position.
Not another Barack Obama.
No.
Unless his sleeves aren't rolled up, then maybe I can handle it for 30 seconds.
No. This is a question about the position the United States is in, because we had Blinken in Tel Aviv. There was reports that the U.S. is trying to get Israel to stop killing so many Palestinians, and it seems quite clear that Netanyahu and the Israeli regime has rebuffed the United States. What do you make of all this?
I find that very implausible.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask. What do you make of it?
No, there are 2 U.S. aircraft carriers now in the Mediterranean. The Congress has just voted $14 billion more to this country, which seems to have it's bottomless in its receivership of U.S. monies. Israel just suffered one of the worst humiliating intelligence catastrophes, not just in its history, but all of modern history. So it's not in a position to say no to the United States. That's just ridiculous. It's just theater. where Netanyahu can play tough. He stood up to the Americans. It's good on election day. And the United States can say, well, we tried, but we couldn't do anything. Of course, you could do something.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyHaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.